Okay, so greetings everyone and welcome. So Geshe was saying I have to remember to greet and welcome everyone, although this is at the beginning of the class, although this is not strictly a Tibetan custom, but it is in the West, so we have to greet and welcome everyone. So the first one to do is to actually adjust our motivation. And we know that if we adjust the motivation, there will be many benefits. From the side of the listener, when you adjust your motivation, this actually puts your mind in an open and relaxed state. And if your mind is in that state, you're much more perceptive to whatever teachings and instructions you receive. So you're not listening, let's say, with an attitude of wishing to pick up mistakes, perhaps in the presentation of the teacher, or to criticize and so forth. You're listening with a pure intention of, let's see how much I can understand here. Let's see what I can learn here. So it's very important for the listener to adjust their motivation. But equally important it is also for the speaker, for the teacher. So when the teacher adjusts his or her motivation, they're not teaching, thinking, how can I become famous, have many followers, and so forth. They're teaching, thinking, how can I bring the most benefit to these students, to those people who are listening to me. Therefore, it is very important that both parties spend some time and properly adjust their motivation for the teachings to go ahead with the maximum benefit for everyone. So today we are continuing with our class with awareness and consciousness. From the sevenfold division, we have completed the first one, which is direct perceivers. In direct perceivers, we have studied the 4 different types, which are sense direct perceivers, mental direct perceivers, self-knower, and yogic direct perceivers. So in our last class, we started with the second of the sevenfold division, which is inference. So we gave a general presentation about inference, and we explained that we have a threefold division. We have inference by renown, inference by the power of the fact, and inference through belief. In last class, we explained the first one, the inference through renown. Today, we will talk about inference through the power of the fact. And hopefully by introducing this second type of inference, it will make it clear what is the difference between inference through renown and through the power of the fact. All right, so we are looking at this particular type of inference through the power of the fact. In order to induce or to generate this type of inference, first of all, as we say, we must rely upon its basis. So in other words, we must have its cause. And its cause is a particular type of sign, a particular type of reason. And this is reason or sign by the power of the fact. By relying on its cause or on its basis, it realizes its object. So this particular type of awareness must have an object of knowledge. What is the object of knowledge that it has? It is the object of knowledge that is called slightly hidden. So remember that we have initially a twofold classification of objects of knowledge, the manifest, or the obvious, and the hidden. And then within the hidden, we had the slightly hidden and the very hidden. So here, between obvious and hidden, the object of knowledge is hidden, but from amongst very hidden and slightly hidden, it is the slightly hidden. It is called slightly hidden because, as you can guess, it is not as difficult to understand as the very hidden. Okay, having said that the object of knowledge is slightly hidden, this is almost in all cases. However, in some cases, you can even have a manifest object that can become its object of knowledge. However, in general, we say its object of knowledge is slightly hidden. To give you some examples, what could be its object of knowledge? What does it realize? It can realize that sound is impermanent, the vase is impermanent, the pillar is impermanent. It can realize the fire that exists up in the top of the mountain, liberation, omniscience, the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, and so forth. So what are all these phenomena, all these objects of knowledge? They are slightly hidden, and to understand them, we have to rely on a reasoning, which is a reason by the power of the fact. Okay, so let's try to give an example, and if we look at it through an example, we will recognize easier what we are talking about. So let's say by seeing smoke, you understand that there is fire up in the mountain. In this case, we are talking about inference by the power of the fact. The reason that has, or the cause that for generating that inference is the thing that has to come first, and that reason is the smoke. By seeing the smoke, this is the first thing that you see, and then this subsequently, it makes you assess the situation and say, oh, okay, so now I infer that there is fire up there in the mountain. So you realize the existence of fire by relying on the reason, which is the rising of the smoke, isn't it? So this is inference by the power of the fact. Okay, so we say that the thing that you realize is the existence of fire in that particular location, which is slightly hidden. Saying that it is slightly hidden, that fire is not necessarily hidden for every individual. For example, for someone who is up there on the top of the mountain next to the fire, they don't need to rely on inference. They can directly see the fire because they're standing next to it. So for that individual, the fire up in the mountain is manifest, obvious, right next to them. However, for some individuals who are not standing next to the fire, if for someone who is looking at the mountain from a distance, for those individuals, the existence of the fire up in the mountain is slightly hidden, and they need to rely on some reason in order to establish its existence. All right. So although fire in general is something which is not slightly hidden, for some individuals, it can be posited as being slightly hidden. Okay, so remember that the etymology in Tibetan of the word that we translate as inference, it's like, remember that it is two syllables, je pak, je meaning subsequent, so means first comes the reason, and by relying on the reason, after you have relied on the reason, and then there comes the second word, the pak. Pak means you assess the situation. So what assessment have you made? You have made the subsequent assessment that there is fire. Okay, so the existence of fire is your assessment. Okay, so we say that this object that you comprehend is a slightly hidden phenomenon. There are actually many slightly hidden phenomena, such as, for example, you can say the existence of the vase, the existence of the pillar, the existence of the house. All of those things, as it was in the case of the fire, we say that for many individuals, those things are obvious, they're manifest, they're not hidden at all. However, for some individuals, in certain circumstances, they become slightly hidden, and therefore we can categorize them as slightly hidden. These are, let's say, the most obvious or the first level of examples of slightly hidden phenomena. If you want to go a bit deeper, more subtle objects that are slightly hidden, then you can talk about sound is impermanent, and so forth. You know, you can look at impermanence and so forth. Okay, so what do we need from all of this? So really, we need to understand inference. And in particular, we need to understand this type of inference, which is influenced by the power of the fact. Important thing to keep in mind is that inference by the power of the fact realizes an object that is slightly hidden. And this object that is slightly hidden, that is realized by this particular type of inference, is not something that inference by the power of renown can realize. And also, it is not something that you need to employ inference by the power of belief in order to understand it. Okay, so it is a type of an object which is somewhere in between. So inference by renown cannot help you understand it. And inference through belief is almost, you don't need to rely on this because it is too advanced. The object that you're dealing with is somewhere there in the middle. If that object that needs to be realized were to become more subtle, then perhaps you would need to rely on inference through belief. But you're not at this subtle level. You are like at the middle level. As we say, the object is only slightly hidden. Therefore, the type of reasoning that you need to rely, the correct type of reasoning that is suitable to help you realize this type of object is reasoning by the power of the fact. Reasoning by the power of the fact it means you actually investigate, you analyze, like, how does that thing exist? How it is? Why is it like this? What is it? And this, the power of the fact that comes through analysis, this type of reasoning will help you generate this inference, which is inference by the power of the fact. So we gave an example here, realizing, for example, that sound is impermanent. You don't need to rely on the scriptures for that. You don't need to say, let me see, what did the Buddha say about sound? Let me see, what did famous scholars, famous yogis said about sound? You don't need to rely on this type of reasoning to establish this. You have to investigate, how does sound exist? Obviously, to establish correctly this sign or this reason by the power of the fact, it takes a little bit of work. You have to do a little bit of work. You have to do a bit of analysis. But this is the right type of reasoning for you to rely upon in order to generate the inference that understands that sound is impermanent. Okay? So as we say, as your reason, I understand that sound is impermanent. And then if you have to give a reason, you never say, because the Buddha said so, or because this scholar said so. You don't say that, because this will be the type of reasoning that you rely upon if you are generating inference through the power of belief, right? It's not helpful. It's not applicable in this case. Also, you cannot understand that sound is impermanent through the reasoning that allows you to understand that it is suitable to apply terminology, right? So you would not be saying sound is impermanent because it is one of the objects of conception. It is irrelevant in this case. So inference by renown is not helping you in this case. This is why we have to have this particular type of inference for this particular level of object. So we are working here with the example of generating the inference by the power of the fact with relation to the statement that sound is impermanent. Okay, so as we say, we're not going to go with faith or belief. We're not going to go with renown. So we have to go relying through the power, a reason that is through the power of the fact. Okay, so basically what we need to do is we need to find reason that establishes impermanence. Okay, so we say sound is impermanent. Why? Because it is a product. Because it is momentary. So what does it mean to be momentary? It means that it changes momentarily. And so here when we say it changes momentarily, it means we're looking at moments or small units of duration of time. So eventually we have to reduce this unit of time within which we understand change taking place to the utmost shortest limit, so the shortest limit of duration. And once we understand that change happens at the limit of time, then we will have properly understood the meaning of impermanence. And at this point, we will have the realization that sound is impermanent. So we don't go down the line saying, oh, because the Buddha said so. It's not correct to do this. Just as we work like this with impermanence, also we work in a similar way with emptiness. There is a lot of reasoning that we need to rely upon that will lead us to the realization of emptiness. And it's important to understand here that when you try to realize emptiness, first you begin with one reasoning, which leads you to another reasoning, to another reasoning. So you follow one reasoning after the other. So these are logical steps. And eventually, at the end of this process, you have a proper understanding. It's like you are spot on. You understand now what it is about. And this is the time that you have the realization. So we do this with emptiness. We do this in order to prove that there is liberation, that there is omniscience, that there is a state of Buddhahood, and so forth. As we say, we don't go down the path that with those things that say the Buddha said so. So it's not an issue of faith. Also, we do not go through renown, like, oh, everybody knows that sound is impermanent, isn't it? We don't want to go through that path. Okay, we want to go through to rely on the reason through the power of the fact. Okay. Right now, at our level, although we say on one level, we say that, or we believe that sound is impermanent, we accept this statement and we say it, we don't have the realization of the inference. What we have is correct assumption. Okay, correct assumption is like number 4 in the list of 7. We will come later on. So correct assumption, we have heard it from our teachers. We've heard it many times, enough times, that we can sort of like correctly assuming that, okay, sound must be impermanent. We don't have the actual realization, because, as we say, impermanence is something that we have to understand at a very subtle level, and we haven't gone to that small limit of time yet. Okay. Okay, so we have explained this inference by the power of the fact. Geshe says, I hope you understood this presentation. If you have understood, please come up with an example. Give me an example. First of all, you need to identify or to understand the object, right? So the object is a slightly hidden phenomenon. When you try to understand a particular type of awareness, the awareness is an object possessor. So these two things go together. Understand the object, and once you understand the type of the object, in this case, a slightly hidden phenomenon, you will understand the corresponding awareness, which in this case is inferenced by the power of the fact. Identify the object first. That will lead you to corresponding awareness.
So I will try. In a highway, there's an ambulance coming and it's a jam. So you know there's an accident in front, but you don't see it.
Okay, so actually Geshe says your reason, by seeing the ambulance, you infer that someone is sick, is in need of medical attention, let's say. It could be true, but it's not always true, because sometimes the ambulance runs down the street because it's going for a service, or sometimes to be washed and cleaned. So it's not always, the ambulance is not always on duty, right? Okay, so we want to have a reason that is indisputable, right? A reason that is 100% the case. So Geshe was saying it's actually very important here to make sure you have a slightly hidden object and to properly give the reason. Okay, so there's quite a lot of emphasis in the reason. We have given the example of generating the inference of sound is impermanent. And we say that you have to give a reason for that. The reason has to come first, or is the first thing that you process in your mind, and the correct reason is that it is a product. And like this, or the other example that we gave, there is fire up in the mountain pass because there is smoke. So this argument of being a product and therefore it is impermanent, or the argument of there is smoke, therefore there is fire, is something which is, it's a very clear case. It's an open and shut book case, isn't it? It is always the case. So when, for example, when we're working with impermanence, the sound is impermanent, or the house is impermanent, or the person is impermanent, the flower is impermanent. Okay, why? So you understand here that you are dealing with a slightly hidden phenomenon, and you say the flower is impermanent because it is a product. And this type of reason that you mention is a reason by the power of the fact, and therefore this generates the inference by the power of the fact. So, for example, we can have inference in relation to liberation. We have to generate inference, and actually we have to see how it is possible to reach the state of liberation. So liberation here is liberation from suffering, and this comes from having stopped afflictions. So basically you have to prove to yourself, or you have to see logically how it is possible to put an end to afflictions. And once you put an end to afflictions, you will be liberated from afflictions. And this is something, although it is a slightly liberation, or achieving liberation is a slightly hidden phenomenon, you can generate inference in relation to that by following that logic through the power of the fact. Similarly with emptiness, similarly with, let's say, the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, similarly with selflessness of phenomena, selflessness of the person, omniscience, and so forth. Okay, so going back, the correct answer should begin with inference regarding, and then you state whatever is the hidden object. So that means that, first of all, you must have identified the slightly hidden object. So inference regarding sound is impermanent. Inference about the human is impermanence. Inference about the house is impermanence. Inference about omniscience. Inference about liberation, and so on and so forth. So it's a type of inference that you generate in the mind, not by relying on scripture, not by relying on renown, but by relying on the reason, which is the power of the fact. And that allows you to realize the slightly hidden object that you mention. So inference of, and then you mention the slightly hidden object. Okay, so Geshe says, tell me an inference by the power of the fact.
Michelle, the influence of happiness and sadness is not permanent.
Okay, that happiness and suffering are not permanent. Is this what you said?
Yes.
Okay.
I won't say suffering, but sadness. I mean, happiness and sadness, joy and sadness is not permanent.
Yeah.
Imagine if we were to buy a lottery with a friend. Lottery hit first place, you are very happy, right? But then the next thing you realize your friend ran away with the lottery, then you get sad. And when you realize your friend actually got arrested by the police and the lottery ticket was given back to you again, and then you're happy again.
Okay, complicated. Okay. So it would be good if we keep it very simple, right? So usually we say inference realizing, let's say, sound is impermanent. All right. So what does that inference realize? It realizes that sound is impermanent by relying on a particular type of reasoning. In your case, what does your inference realize through all this story? Inference realizing? Tell us. Okay, so Geshe was saying, for example, you can say that due to seeing fire, you realize, due to seeing smoke, you realize that there is fire. Because the seeing of smoke is something that happens first, and this leads you to the realization that there must be fire. Therefore, this leads you to generating inference, isn't it? So you generate the inference about the existence of fire because you rely on a previous reason, and the reason here is the smoke. Now, there could be the case that later on you think about that mountain, and without having a reason, okay, you just keep thinking, mountain, what is up there in the mountain? Without having the reason of the smoke, you just think there is fire up there. In this case, you have some thought. So this is just a thought. This is just a conception, but it is not inference because it is not something which is generated by relying on a reason. So this is something that we need to understand very clearly. To call a particular type of awareness inference, and you say, I have generated the inference regarding this and this, you must have relied upon a reason. Inference requires a reason. If there is no reason, and for no reason, you just have the thought, there must be a fire, there is a fire up there. This is just a thought, just a conception. So we know that we have some cases where we can come to the conclusion that fire exists without needing to rely on a reason. So, for example, when you're standing next to the fire, you don't need any particular reasoning. You just have direct perception. You have sense direct perception. So sense direct perception lead you to realize the existence of the fire without needing to rely on a reason. And Geshe says, I think my personal thought, my position is that there are cases where you can just sit down and think without necessarily relying on the reason and realize the existence of the fire. In this case, it's a mere conception. All right. So in the case of direct perception, and especially sense direct perception, and in the case of conception, just conception, you can come to understand, let's say, the existence of fire here without needing to rely on a reason. If it is inference, inference must rely on a reason. Okay, so Geshe says for this case of conception, that you come to understand the existence of fire, this is my position. I think that there are cases where you should be able to sit down and think about it and understand that it's there without the reason. So Geshe was saying, here I shared with you my thought that I think that you can generate conceptual mind, realizing the existence of fire. I don't know if you were to develop continuous familiarity with this conceptual mind, whether this conceptual mind eventually will transform into non-conceptual, meaning into direct perception. Because if it were to transform at some point into direct perception, then perhaps the continuum of that initial conceptual thought would be something that continues all the way to Buddhahood. We know that there are cases where conceptual mind becomes non-conceptual, becomes direct perception. So, for example, whilst we meditate on the path of preparation, the mind that we have during the stages of the heat, the peak, the patience, supreme mundane dharma are conceptual minds. However, that conceptual mind becomes, really the generic image becomes thinner and thinner and thinner, so that eventually you move into the next stage, which becomes direct perception. It becomes yogic direct perception. So we know that there are cases where conceptual mind can become non-conceptual through repeated familiarity with meditation. And Geshe says, I don't know, I am in doubt whether the type of conceptual mind I'm talking about can become non-conceptual. So Geshe was saying, there are those who say that when you have the conceptual mind apprehending that there is fire that exists on the top of the mountain, there are those who say that there is no way you can take that conceptual mind all the way to the ground of Buddhahood, because at the ground of Buddhahood, when you reach there, there is no conception, right? So obviously this is a type of conceptual mind that at some point you have to leave behind. For example, when we have the conception that is grasping at the self-grasping conception, we know that in order to reach the state of Buddhahood, this is something that we have to leave behind. Not just leave behind, but this is an object of abandonment. Therefore, this is something that needs to be abandoned. However, the conception apprehending the existence of fire on top of the mountain is not an object of abandonment. All right, so it doesn't need to be abandoned. However, it's a conception and you cannot take it to Buddhahood. You cannot carry it. At some point, you have to leave it behind. So Geshe was saying, I wonder what is the method, the mechanism, in which way do we leave these conceptions behind? Okay, Geshe was saying, I think we will stop here today with a presentation of inference by the power of the fact, because we need to introduce the next one, which is inference by the power of faith. So first of all, we need to understand the object that is established or is proven by this type of inference. It has to be a very hidden phenomenon. And the very hidden phenomenon is something that we establish through a particular type of reasoning. Reasoning by renown is not going to be of much help. Reasoning through the power of the fact is not sufficient. So here we have to go through reasoning by the power of faith, having faith in the quotations of great renowned scholars and in the speech of the Buddha. So a particular type of inference, understanding very hidden phenomena by relying on reason of faith. All right, so let's give an example of very hidden phenomenon that is realized through this type of inference, through the power of belief. So we say through generosity come great resources. To actually understand in great detail how through specific acts of generosity we establish the result of specific instances of wealth, this is something which is extremely hidden. So, for example, we come into this life, and in this life we have certain resources, a certain amount of wealth. Obviously, this is the result that has come from a previous life, but we cannot pinpoint and be accurate and say it was that particular act of generosity that I did in this and this time in my previous life that has caused me to have this particular resource or wealth in this life. Similarly, in this life, we engage in acts of generosity, and we understand that there will be some future results from these results of abundance and wealth, but we cannot actually pinpoint and say this particular action of generosity was the cause for that specific amount, let's say, of help, of resources in the future. Many times we say, okay, in this life, I helped this person, and I know that later on, and then I know that later on this person also helped me back, or I received support from them as well. Now, actually, this is something that we say as an example, and it is an example that can help reinforce our faith in practicing generosity or being supportive of others. However, there is no certainty that links the two events together. And to prove that these two are linked is extremely difficult, all right? So it increases our faith to say, I did this, and then other people helped me later on when I was in need, I received money and so forth. But there is no certainty. So what type of reason do we need in order to establish this inference? We say we need to rely on a reason that is actually scripture. So scriptural quotation, it can come from scholars or wise beings, or it can be scriptures from the teachings of the Buddha and so forth. So by relying, having faith on these scriptures, scriptural quotations, we generate this specific type of inference in relation to a very hidden phenomenon. Okay, so we have quite a lot of those quotations, if you want, or those values, really. And we say, if you practice generosity now, in your next life, you will have wealth. If you practice ethics, you will obtain a higher rebirth. If you practice patience, you will have beauty. If you practice enthusiastic effort, you will achieve greatness, and so forth. But can we really prove those things? Really? What can we say? The only thing we can say here is we go through the general rule that when you have a cause of a particular type, this cause of a particular type will bring about a result of a similar type. So, for example, if you plant chili seeds, right, the hot chili, if the seeds are hot from the hot chili, the type of plant that you will get from that is a plant that will be hot. So you will get hot chili plant from that. Similar, so the result is of similar type with the cause. So this is the general rule that we follow here. So we have given some examples in terms of virtue, because we say if you practice generosity, if you practice patience, if you practice ethics, you get this and this good results. We can also go with examples of non-virtue. So they say, for example, if you kill, the result is that in your next life, you will have a short lifespan. Okay, why do we say this? Because we have made this observation, and we follow this general rule, and you say, okay, if you kill someone, what you do is you shorten their lifespan, so you are going to get a result, you will have to experience a result that's similar to what you have caused. You make someone's life shorter, so you're going to come back next life and your life is going to be shorter. So that's a general rule, but if someone were to say, prove it to me, what's the reasoning, what's the proof for that? It will be very difficult to actually prove it. And therefore, at the end, we say that we have this type of inference, but the reason we rely upon is faith in the scriptural quotations. We have faith in the sayings of the Buddha, in the sayings of great scholars of our tradition, and so on and so forth. So as you can see here, we're dealing with very hidden phenomena that we try to establish. The word very in front of the hidden indicates it's not just hidden, it is very hidden, meaning it is very difficult to realize. And this is the why the reason by the power of the fact is not sufficient, because the object is very difficult to understand. Okay, so we have to go through the power of the faith here. So the reason is reason through the power of faith in scriptural quotation, and the inference is inference through the power of faith. Okay, so as we gave the examples on, as we say, on the side of the virtue, we also give examples on the opposites of non-virtuous. So, for example, we said if you are patient, you will have beauty in your next life. And then we say, okay, so if you're not patient, you will come as a very ugly person in your next life. Okay, and you hear that, and it's like it frightens you. Who wants to come back as an ugly person? All right, so it's like, oh, I have to be careful here. I don't want to come back as an ugly person. But actually, we cannot really prove those things. And you know what? Here we're talking about results or details about our future life, the next life. So the first question is there a next life or not? This, first of all, this is the first thing that we have to prove. The majority of people in the world do not believe in the existence of next life. So if you start talking to them about details of your next life, will you be rich? Will you be handsome? Will you be, will it be a good rebirth? They look at you and say, what are you talking about? I'm not sure that I believe in the existence of next life. So first, ideally, we have to prove the existence of future lives, okay? Once you prove the existence and you say, okay, there will be a next life, then there is the question, can I actually establish through particular causes, specific results, specific details that I want to see in my next life? And once you prove this, then you can start discussing about through patience comes beauty and so forth, so on and so forth. Okay, so all of those things are extremely difficult to prove. And we cannot give the exact reason. And this is why we say here we have to rely on faith. So these are very difficult subjects to prove, very hidden phenomena. And for very hidden phenomena, we need to rely on faith. And that's why we generate inference through the power of faith. Actually, inference through the power of faith is very important for us. So today's subject is very important. Okay, the other thing, the reason by relying on faith, relying on this, having faith in the scriptures. Now, you have to understand that it's a very sensitive issue because, for example, non-Buddhists will not have any faith or any respect or even any knowledge of what the Buddha said or what this great scholar or what this great Buddhist author have said here or there. And even if they know it, it doesn't necessarily mean they accept it. So here, when we try to prove very hidden phenomena and we say we have to give a reason of faith by relying on scripture, the one who expresses or gives this reason must be a Buddhist, and the one who hears, receives this type of reasoning in order to generate this inference, again, it must be a Buddhist. If you're not a Buddhist, you are not going to accept the reasoning that says it is like this because the Buddha said so, or because this and this scripture, this text, our text says so. You won't know it, you won't believe it, you won't accept it. Non-Buddhists do not accept those things. So even those statements that we say that from generosity comes wealth, or if you kill, you will end up with a short life. These are the type of arguments or reasoning that can only exchange between Buddhists, isn't it? Otherwise, it doesn't, it's not an argument that will be followed or accepted by non-Buddhists. So Geshe says, this is what I believe. Okay, so there's, we mentioned here that in the third case, we are using scripture. We rely on scripture and quotation, and we say we should have faith in the scripture. But if you say actually to anyone, you should have faith, you should just believe this, all right? Everyone has a problem with that. Okay, so why? Why is it that I should believe what this text says? Why should I believe this particular scripture, this quotation? So it's not actually any and every text, any and every quotation that we believe. We believe scriptures and quotations that are free from contradictions and mistakes. We believe or we rely upon texts and scriptures that are free from mistakes, that have passed the 3 examinations. So, for example, we say we rely on the quotation that says, from generosity comes wealth. Take that, we rely on this. Why? Because the part of the scripture that is teaching this is incontrovertible. So it means it is not deceptive, because it has passed the 3 examinations. So we're not asking people to accept scripture and text blindly, blind faith. We say it has to be a correct scripture that has been verified in 3 ways. And this is what we ask you to accept, to have faith in. So, as we say, it's not that we ask people to have kind of like blind faith on any type of scripture. The scripture that we rely and we have faith upon must be free from 3 faults, right? So let's look at this. So with respect to its teaching, so with respect to whatever this scripture or text is teaching, in our case, what is its teaching? It's teaching that from generosity comes wealth. So with respect to its teaching, it should not be damaged, it should not be harmed by direct prime cognition. It should not be damaged by inference that comes through the power of the fact. And it should not have confusion or contradiction between the earlier parts and the later parts. Okay, so let's explain each one of them with example. So for the first one, we say it should not be harmed by direct prime cognition. So if it is describing something which we all know, which can all see that is white, and the text tells you that object or that thing is black, you will say, hold on a minute, I can see with my own eyes, direct perception, that this is not white, it is black, or whatever is the case. Okay, if it's white, it says it's black. You say you disagree. No. So if there is such a contradiction, it's not valid. The second one, if, for example, is teaching that sound is permanent, then again, you reject it because you know that there is inference through the power of the fact that is generated that proves that sound is impermanent. The third mistake that can happen is that in earlier parts of the text, it describes it being one way, and then in later part of the text, it says the exact opposite. No, it's not like this, it's like that, the exact opposite. So here we say that we have faith and we will rely upon text that through analysis, they are found to be free of these three mistakes. So if the scripture is free of these three mistakes, why should we not have faith in it? If you want to have faith and you want to follow any text without any examination, with your eyes closed, faith like blind faith, this can be a personal choice. But Geshe says, I think that when we say here, we're going to use a text, a scripture as our reasoning and have faith in this, it should be something that is proven to be free of the three faults through analysis. So what means here, what's the consequence of what we're saying here is that actually we are encouraged to examine the speech of the Buddha. We don't just accept the speech of the Buddha. We should examine whether those quotations, the text, the teachings are free from those three faults. Actually, the Buddha himself has encouraged us. So he has said, monks and scholars do not accept my speech out of reverence and respect because of my status. You should examine it similarly to the three ways that we examine gold, right? So the Buddha says, do not accept what I say because whatever, I'm an important, famous, impressive individual. You should examine whether my speech is valid. So from our side, we should examine and say, let me see if there is any harm here from direct prime conception. Is there any harm from inference through the power of the inference to the power of the fact? Is there any harm in terms of contradiction, earlier parts and later parts? If it is free from these three faults, then I will accept it. So from our side, we should examine. So it's a very important point here. We say we ask you to have faith, to rely with faith, but there is a reason behind that faith, like your faith is justified. We're not saying that you should have this blind faith, like I have no reasoning, I have no idea what's going on here, but I'm going to blindly follow this. I will have blind faith. This is not what we're saying here. We say, have faith and accept these teachings or these scriptures because they have been proven to be, they can be proven to be free from the three faults through analysis. So there is reason here. There is work that you can do in order to examine, in order to investigate. And then if you examine and investigate and you find that this teaching or this scripture does not have any faults, does not have any mistakes, then why shouldn't you have faith? Why shouldn't you have the confidence to follow that? On the other hand, if you examine and you see there is no fault with direct valid perception, there is no fault with inference by the power of the fact, there is no fault of contradiction of the earlier and the later parts, you examine, you find there is no fault, and still you say, no, I'm not going to accept it, I have no faith in it, well then unfortunately you're going backwards, you're not progressing. All right, so hopefully through understanding what sort of scripture is correct of mistakes, you generate faith in that, then you can rely on that, then there can be progress. Also, there is another way we can think, which is reasoning that supports this whole issue of faith and why we should follow the teachings of the Buddha. So in that, the discussion is that if we look at the teachings of the Buddha, there are some issues, you could say they are the main, the root, like the core values of the teachings of the Buddha. And there are some other things that are secondary. So the core values, what are those? They are things about the teachings about liberation, about emptiness, about omniscience, about the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, such as impermanence and so forth. These are the main, the root, the core values. And these are actually things that are established very clearly through inference by the power of the fact. We say that if you do this, you actually establish them spot on. And if the core issues in the teachings of the Buddha, such as the ones that we mentioned here, are proven and they are incontrovertible, there is no deception whatsoever. So if there's no deception in the main, the core issues, why should there be any deception in secondary things, such as, for example, the presentation of the law of cause and effect, those things that we say, from practicing generosity in this life, you will have wealth in your next life. Why? All right. So it is the same in everyday life. You have a person that carries on very important projects, and whatever, they need to talk about the projects, what they achieve, how they will achieve. If this person is really solid and honest in their presentation of this major work that they undertake, why would they ever lie about smaller things in their everyday life? Okay, so if someone doubts the validity of this person, we would say, but can you see how honest this person is when they're dealing with this and this big responsibility? Why are you doubting small everyday things that they say? Okay, so here the argument is that since the root core values of the teachings of the Buddha, such as liberation, emptiness, omniscience, impermanence, and so forth, are spot on established through reasoning by the power of the fact, we see that since he is totally honest about those things, there is no reason to deceive us about other teachings as well. Okay, so as you can see here, we have discussed at length why it is important and how we can follow through faith all the scriptural quotation of all the great scholars who give us this advice. So act accordingly, practice more generosity, practice more ethics. Think about how beautiful you can be in your next life. Think about your good look in your next life. Practice patience and so forth. So Geshe says, I expect you now to follow all these quotations and act accordingly. Thank you, everyone. See you next week. Thank you, Geshe.